Hello, welcome to today's webinar. Thank you for joining us. It's my pleasure today to be speaking with Randi Weingarten, the president of the American Federation of Teachers. She is an alumnus of the school that I'm dean of, the Cornell University ILR School, and it's an absolute pleasure to be talking with her today. Welcome, Randi. Nice to see you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Dean. So I love that. I love that I'm with you, even though it's virtually.
Yeah.
Wait till I can be back up on campus. And I just want to say, even before we start, the purpose of the ILR school for all these years, I got an amazing education out of ILR. I don't know whether it was I love reading or I loathe reading when we were there, what we used to tease about the mnemonic, but it's an amazing school, and I am so glad that you are the dean of it.
Oh, thank you very much. No, really, really appreciate that. And, it's been a real privilege to lead this school. That we're in our 75th year since our founding. We were originally founded by an act of the state of New York, founded a school to improve labor management relations in the state and benefit both the New York State and the country through our efforts there working with labor and management to produce good cooperative labor management relations. And hopefully we're continuing on that mission today. We're trying our best to do that, to really promote a positive environment for labor relations in this country. So something I think is still really essential to this country today.
Really?
Now, you lead a union of hundreds of thousands, a million or so, I believe, members, teachers, educational workers. And as we're getting ready for this conversation, I was realizing that, it's been just over a year since we entered the pandemic, and your members who educate millions, tens of millions of American children had to pivot very quickly. We entered a mode where we were moving remotely on things to try and protect the country from the health consequences. I'm sure many of your members were affected by the pandemic personally and their family members, but they also had to keep providing education to all these students that I know they care so much about. Can you talk a little about that impact that the pandemic had on them and the struggle to try and continue education during this incredibly difficult period?
Sure. I thank you for that question. So the AFT these days, we are 1.7 million members. We actually over the course of the last 10 years, we've actually grown net about 250,000 members, which makes us, on some levels, not only one of the largest unions in America, but one who, even with the last recession, Janus, we have actually grown. And part of where we've grown is we represent about 200,000 nurses and healthcare professionals, including a new unit that just got a contract in Bend, Oregon, at St. Charles. There are other, we represent public employees, bus drivers, PSRPs, teachers. That's how most people are most familiar with us, like because of the big units in Miami-Dade, LA, Chicago, New York City. But we also represent college professors and graduate workers and adjunct teachers. So the through line for us is people who actually make a difference in other people's lives. And so, what we saw, frankly, from last, Sarah Nelson and I were teasing each other on one of these Zooms, the head of the flight attendants, because February 2nd of last year, she and I held a first press conference chiding the Trump administration to actually do something about COVID, because we were seeing some COVID cases in schools because we do a lot of workplace safety issues. She was seeing it in airlines. We were seeing a lot of it coming in from people kept on focusing on China, as opposed to Europe. So, we were doing the normal stuff about infectious disease control, wash your hands, things that we have done so often because of, Ebola, MRSA, things like that. The reason I'm starting here is because that was February 2nd. And many of us kept on asking the CDC then, the Trump administration, you kept seeing things, hearing from friends in other countries, and getting basically nothing from the administration about what was going on other than pablum saying, oh, don't worry, be happy, everything's going to be fine. And so what essentially happened was that second week in March, after you saw the outbreak in New Rochelle, we started seeing cases in the Bronx. We started seeing, and we started seeing cases in all sorts of other places, and had this basically impervious administration everywhere until the second week in March, when then everything started closing. Everything started closing. So you had a lot of deaths of my members, teachers, paraprofessionals in New York City. You had, for example, when the weekend in which we tried to close the New York City schools, and there was an outbreak in the UFT, then the only two people who were not hospitalized or very, very sick from that outbreak was the current UFT president, Michael Mulgrew, and myself. And everyone else who we were with, white, black, brown, hospitalized, very seriously ill, the weekend that we were in that office trying to close. I say all this because it created great distrust, because you saw things, you knew something was happening, and even the health people were saying, oh no, don't worry. The CDC, the old CDC, oh no, you can keep on opening schools. And so that's part of the kind of reluctance, the kind of distrust that you're still seeing in different pockets. But in terms of educators, what essentially happened was within 1 week, we went from in school, feeding kids, doing everything in school, to remote education where lots of kids did not have devices at home, and we didn't know whether or not their parents had or they had any kind of internet. So those first 2 or 3 months, you're basically drinking from a fire hose all over the country. Frankly, all of us hoping that this was only going to be 14 days. And the teachers of the country, and you saw tremendous gratitude to them. I mean, you saw all the memes about, because all of a sudden, parents had a front row seat now on what we do, on the arts and the science, on the magic of teaching. And those first few weeks, everybody was doing whatever they could. Thank God we still had Zoom, but, different platforms were available. Some things worked, some things didn't. Then there was a Zoom bombing. So what we've seen from our membership, and frankly, districts all across the country, is that people work together like, frankly, never before in those first few weeks, trying to feed kids, trying to get kids hotspots, trying to make sure that bus drivers were often bringing food to kids, but also picking up their assignments. And so last year was basically just drinking from a fire hose, knowing full well that remote doesn't work nearly as well as in person, and hoping against hope that we would be back in school with people doing whatever they could to keep kids calm, keep kids engaged, and just trying to kind of like land the plane for last year's schooling. I can go through this year, a whole nother thing, but it was pretty remarkable. Let me just also say that where we were really worried last year was that in our health institutions, people didn't have PPE. People were dying, people were getting sick, and the union, we actually scoured the globe, including, trying to figure out how to get and bought $3 million worth of PPE for our members. and for hospitals and for others just because of that huge shortage. So food, hotspots, PPE, using our Share My Lesson platform for everything to just really create a connection during those very, very, very scary first few months.
Yeah, I think it was really striking. You talk about the basic question of food, providing food, how much this revealed the role of schools as community centers, as sort of part of the backbone of our communities. I mean, I saw it in our own community here that the school bus drivers were out taking school meals out to individuals around in the community, because this is part of the infrastructure of how we provide food security to our population. And I think the pandemic has shown a lot of that kind of aspect of what's essential, what are the essential things to the functioning of our society. It was a really striking part of that experience as we tried to respond to this.
I think that people if you had heard me talk about remote education pre-pandemic, I would have said that remote, that online and remote, is a supplement. It doesn't supplant. It's not a supplement. It's not a substitute. But I think which now I think basically everyone in America sees and understands and knows. It used to be like the right wing thought that you could do this both in terms of higher ed and pre-K-12. But I don't think people saw just how important, in school is for so many reasons. Schooling it shouldn't be viewed as childcare, and it rankles all of us when it is. But obviously, it is very important in terms of its custodial function for parents who work outside of the home. But it's also really one of the most important community services separate from academic that we do for children in America. And you saw with the 16 million kids who still don't have reliable internet in a cheap, reliable way. They may have, devices now because we've been able to get them devices, and the 30 million kids a day that we feed. And now, going into the next school year, what we need to do to ensure that we are meeting the social, the emotional, and the academic needs, not only of kids, but of families, and supporting educators through this process of recovery.
Yeah. Moving forward to that question of this academic year and moving forward, one of the great challenges this year has been this process of trying to work towards reopening schools and delivering education in the way that we want it to be effective for the students. I know this is something that you and you've been working on really hard over the course of this year. Where do things stand? It's hard to get a picture often because you hear various things going on across the country, and it's such a big country. It's sometimes hard to get a sense of where we're at, and you hear a lot of these debates that pick up anecdotes. So you go around the country, you've seen this, on the ground. Where do we stand right now in this?
So let me, and this is probably going to be for anyone who's watching this, who has watched Fox or other right-wing channels, nothing that I'm about to say is going to sound correct, because they need to make someone else to blame other than Donald Trump for what we found ourselves in this year. So let me just give people a bit of a pause, take a cup of coffee, walk away from the screen. I don't want to create agita, but these are the facts of where we are right now. Joe Biden is going to announce in the next few days that he has actually well passed his goal of reopening the majority of K-8 schools, in his first 100 days. Whether you look at the private sector Burbio reports, whether you look at what is now the public sector reports, the majority of K-8 schools are open for in-person learning right now, and we're doing as fast a job as we can to open up high schools. In terms of statistics from my union, we work in about 3,000 districts. 95% of those districts have in-person learning now. 95% of those districts have in-person learning. Sometimes it switches a couple of days because, for example, a few schools last week were closed in Douglas County because of the outbreak of the variant. There's an issue now in terms of Detroit because of the outbreak of the variant. But 95% of the schools, the local or the districts in which my members work, are open in person. 85% of my members are working in-person learning. 81% of my members, as of the beginning of April, had their vaccinations, and another 10% really want them. So we have 10% who don't, 90% who do, of which 8 out of 10 at 9 had already gotten them. And what we saw over and over again from last July on is that my membership trusted that when we said that in-person schooling is really important, and there's a roadmap for doing it, of basically the safety, layered mitigation of the mask, the spacing, the ventilation, the cleaning, the contact tracing, and hand washing, that if we did testing, like the Rockefeller Foundation has really helped create, and SUNY has been doing it in a masterful job, as has the NFL, that's what kept them in the season, and access to vaccines. Those three things, plus the relationships of working together and creating trust, that's the roadmap. As Miguel Cardona said at a school that I was with him at today in White Plains, where 90% of the elementary school students are back in, and 70% of the high school students. And there was joy in White Plains today as we were serenaded by a mariachi band and by a jazz band, outside, of course. Yeah. But that's where we really are. And we would have gotten there. And this is where we would have gotten there if in September and October, if the administration had actually done what the Biden administration did. We begged the last administration to give us data so that we knew, what was going on, where there was COVID, where there wasn't, to give us data, for the CDC to actually come out plainly with a set of safeguards that we could rely on consistently in schools, and where we would have the resources to do these things, including testing. That's why New York City was able to reopen, and that's why places all across the country in September and October who followed that advice was able to open, but they refused. And look what happened, even in the surge in December and January, even with the variants now, when the Biden administration basically said, yes, we're going to put the data out, we're going to be transparent, the CDC will get you safeguards that you can rely on as quickly as possible. They did that the middle of February, and we're going to get you the resources, the American Rescue Plan. So he starts January 20th. Mm-hmm. The first guidelines were out February 16th. The rescue plan was done by the end of February, early March. And now, look, overwhelmingly, schools are reopened for in-person learning because we know how important that is for kids.
Yeah, I think it's one of those really striking things that the appreciation that parents have for schools, that they want their kids in the schools, and how important that is. On this question of what we need in terms of the conditions to make sure every school can do this safely. I'm dean of college here, Cornell, where we were able to operate in person with a lot of precautions, very heavy use of mask, distancing. We're able to do it safely here, successfully with a lot of testing. We have a lot of resources, right, at Cornell, so we're able to do the best practices on everything. With the rescue plan money, right, you've got these funds starting to flow now. How is that going in terms of getting out to the school districts across the country? Are the school districts using it the way that you want to see? Where's the situation on that? Are there areas that they need to be focusing on in terms of how the money's being used and using it effectively?
So I think for this year, I think we're going to know more of that at the beginning of the next school year.
Yeah.
Meaning, because this year is still about really just trying to get kids back in and trying to create more routines and a sense of dealing with emotional, social, and the effects of social isolation. This is we heard this in White Plains today. I was in a school in Stapleton, New Mexico, a couple of weeks ago, and let me just say, I wouldn't be traveling to these schools right now unless I had been double vaxxed,
right,
and obviously more than 2 weeks out. And in every place I go, regardless of whether I'm inside or outside, I'm wearing a mask with people because, I think it's important to do all that. But it is really important to see people. Yeah. People miss each other and they miss in person. And that, I saw the New York Times, called it something like we're languishing right now. But the effects of this piece of the pandemic are really stark in that there is a kind of a low-grade depression everywhere. Mm-hmm. And so this year, right now, it's really a matter of trying to create some sense of joy and some sense of normal routines for kids, so that they see their friends, they are together, and for educators, you're seeing the in-person cues. But the point is, there's lots of people who are still, very reluctant. There's a lot of parents. It's the unwritten story here is that, the vast numbers of Black and brown parents are still reluctant to send their kids back to in-person learning. Right. So when we talk about effectiveness, I would say that there's kind of three big buckets that we're going to have to spend this money in. Four big buckets. Mm-hmm. One is obviously the safety issues, ventilation fixes, making sure there's spacing. The PPE has been bought, but it's expensive to do the cleaning the way it is. And all those safety issues. And frankly, we're going to have the space next year because we should not do hybrid. If there's still people who are doing remote should do remote, in-person should be in-person, and this kind of hybrid attempt or, attempting to teach in-person and online at the same time, it doesn't work. You cannot watch your students in person and then watch your students online at the same time. So there's going to still have to be some space to be found because the 3-foot rule hopefully will align that with class sizes and on. So space is one.
Yeah.
The three other pieces are the social emotional piece in terms of real engagement. How do we make sure that well-being is really focused on? And that's different than trauma and kids who are in extremis. What do we do in terms of well-being? Do we have the nurses? Do we have the guidance counselors? Do we have wraparound services, including a panoply of after school and other kinds of things that kids feel good about, including sports? The third big bucket is going to have to be academic recovery. Mm-hmm. And I really push away from the issue of learning loss. Mm-hmm. Kids have learned a lot right now, and kids are pretty resilient. It doesn't mean that there's not a lot of loss. But when you say learning loss, it presumes it's the kid's fault. No, it's COVID's fault. And we have to actually think about this whole next year as a year of recovery and renewal and how we help kids get to where they ought to be over the course of the whole year.
Yeah.
And the last bucket is going to be, there's going to be lots of trauma. That's why I separate well-being from trauma. There's going to be lots of trauma. There's going to be lots of loss. There's going to be lots of intense need. And we need to make sure that we are dealing with that intense need. So maybe it's tutoring aligned with schooling. Maybe it's mental health counseling aligned with schooling. But we have to make sure that we can do that not only for kids, but for families, and also support the teachers. So those are kind of the four big areas: safety, emotional, social, academic, and then the intense interventions that we need to do. With all of that, teachers are going to have to be trained and have to be supported. And I think that there's a lot of money that's come through the rescue plan, and I'm hopeful that if people work together, which is what Miguel Cardona wants, to work on what it should look like, we're going to be in good shape.
Yeah, it's really striking when we think about the sort of scale of what's been going on, that what we've had to work through, and then the efforts to get out of it. You know, I think of the historical analogies that we teach about. You know, it's almost like a wartime type economy situation, right, where society as a whole is affected and over an extended period of time. And even as we kind of look towards the end of it now with the vaccinations and the hope that in the fall we'll really start getting out of it, we're going to be in this period, a sort of almost post-war kind of recovery period.
That's
and
exactly right.
Out of this.
But think about it, Alex. Think about the number of deaths.
Yeah.
We are approaching the number of deaths in the Civil War.
Yeah.
That's what we're approaching. It's far beyond any other war. And maybe it's because I live in all these different worlds. Yeah. But, you know, there's some worlds, you know, there's a lot of white folk who don't know a person who's died. Yeah. And you know, it's just COVID has hit people so differently, dependent upon population. Yeah. It's part of, we've had a once in a century pandemic combined with deep polarization about who we are as a country. And it's not just the George Floyd killing, but you think about the fights that have happened about we are becoming a multiracial society. Mm-hmm. And there's a whole bunch of folks that don't want that. And then on top of that, all the climate issues. And then on top of that, all the democracy issues. Right. It's been a few years like no other.
Yeah. I was really struck by one article, I think it was LA Times, that did this really in-depth reporting on why you see this differential impact on Black and brown communities. And they were talking through the housing differentials, the fact that you could have multi-generational families in relatively small apartment spaces, and the inability to control COVID spread, and with members of the family working in frontline service jobs, jobs where the ability to distance at work wasn't there, or in manufacturing settings where there were similar difficulties, and then it would be brought into the home and run through the home. And that kind of, I think it's a lens into how people live and work that we've kind of ignored as a society. We don't think about that kind of a nexus of the work and the family, and looking into parts of our society beyond kind of our regular experiences. I think this would really open that up to what's actually going on.
I hope that what it will do, both all of the crises that are converging, that it will ultimately give us some more grace and some more an ability to be more reflective about other people's lived experiences. I think right now, people are so frustrated. I was on the phone with a bunch of several parents from around the country, who basically were, criticizing me on Twitter, and then a couple of them direct messaged me and said, "Will you talk to us?" And I said, "Yeah, of course." And we set up this Zoom. We had a fascinating conversation, because part of this is there's such a deep frustration right now that it's hard for anybody to see beyond what they need to do for their own kids, because the isolation has really, I would say, deeply affected kids, almost more than anything else, which is why people want their kids back in school so badly, as opposed to doing Zoom school. But I do hope that next year, it can go both ways. We can become a more caring, a more open-hearted nation, frankly, which is what happened after World War II. Or we can, go through this kind of America first isolationism, which is what happened after World War I. And so, the question becomes, and then on top of it, what do we do about how do we become how do we really, truly understand each other's lived experiences, which are really, as you just said, there's so many of us who live in multi-generational households. And how do we really see each other for who we are and the dignity of each other, as opposed to, and deconstruct the racism and the intentional racism that we have inherited as a society, but we have not ultimately done what we need to do to change it.
Yeah. So one of the things that was really important in that post-war period, kind of coming out of World War II, was the period when we established our system of labor relations and the great growth of collective bargaining as really the engine of middle-class prosperity in America after World War II. We've had a labor relations system that's really rooted in that kind of period and development of collective bargaining. It seems that in the last couple of years, there's been an increasing feeling that there's pressure for change in the system. We've had a long-term decline in union representation overall, though some sectors and some unions, including yours, have bucked that trend. And we've seen things like the Red strikes that really energized, I think, the labor movement and made a difference for teachers. But we're also seeing tensions, right? We saw the Bessemer Amazon organizing effort ending up with the union being unsuccessful in the vote. But we also have a new administration and a president who talks in a way about unions, I think, different than a president we've heard for a very long time. In terms of his commitment to labor. Where do you see things going the next few years? What direction are we heading in?
So I think I often say that I think the next few years can be a renaissance for public education and a resurgence of collective bargaining. And I think about these three, for regular folk, like people who are not born with a silver spoon in their mouths, there's three real opportunity agents: voting, the franchise, public education, and the labor movement. And what has happened in terms of how the politics have changed in America is that voting used to be something like for the 60s and 70s that Republicans and Democrats both thought were important, both pushed President Bush re-up the Voting Rights Act, give him credit for that. And what has happened since is you see the two sides basically saying, I got mine. I'm not going to share power. And then you got the other side, and, be very careful since I get in trouble when I start talking in class terms. And then the other side basically saying, we need to have the ladder of opportunity for everyone. And what the labor movement did was they were about, and they are about, we need to have the ladder of opportunity for everyone. So the labor movement originally was one of the big progenitors of public education, because that was our kids, working class kids. The labor movement was the ticket out of poverty and the ticket to the middle class. And even when we don't have the density that we used to have, the labor movements, there's still a union advantage if you're in a union, whether you're white, black, brown, or female. The labor movement was also, frankly, one of the few places where there was a real fight for equality and against discrimination. So, for example, in my union, we actually expelled our segregated locals in the 1950s. And the UAW and we and others were the ones who helped finance not just the March on Washington, but the March in Selma and King and others. And so, but there was a sense that, so the key now, I think, is this. And, Bessemer, I think, will be, Amazon, to take on Amazon, it has to be all unions. It can't just be, and the RWDSU did a valiant job, but you got the biggest corporation in the world, just like when Ford did this against, Ford and GM, and you look at the struggles, the UAW, sorry, my dog is about to bark at me. You look at Zoom at home, look at the UAW, and the sit-down strikes that had to happen. It didn't happen just the first time. You look at the coal miners. You look, so what, these are long struggles. But the difference is this. For the first time since FDR, there is a president of the United States, first time, no other Democrat or Republican president has done this, who has said that the point of the National Labor Relations Act was for workers to decide, not management to decide. It was about, do workers want collective bargaining? And do they want to join with others in terms of having a different way of bettering their conditions at work? And this president is saying that's his policy. And that's what the PRO Act is. And so what I think will happen is that, of course, there will be cases where workers say, no, I don't want. But overwhelmingly, 73% of the country believes in collective bargaining. 60% of people who are non-union would like to have unions. These are all statistics that are, that have been done, in the public realm. Gallup has seen a almost 20-point increase in favorability of unions. And I'm seeing it in our membership in terms of the calls that we get to actually unionize, because most people want a voice at work and want to be treated with dignity and respect. And the last thing I'll say about this is this, which is this president sees it as a way of an economic tool for bettering society. In a capitalist system, unions become the way that workers can have better wages. But what it also is a way of increasing the services and creating better quality. Because when you actually have people who work together at a local level, representing labor and management, it is what Dr. Cardona said today. It's relationships and resources that create trust. So we believe in something we call solution-driven unionism, which is you solve problems for the public good. Does it work that way every time? No, of course not. But ultimately, what you see in countries with high unionization is that the services are better, the wages are better, and that lifts up a generation of folks.
One of the things that was really striking to me about the Red for Ed strikes is that we were seeing job action by teachers in some states that don't have collective bargaining rights. That they were in parts of the country where, to some degree, I think there'd been a stereotype that unions had no chance there. There wasn't kind of any possibility of labor action. I know the AFT's often out there in these kind of states. Can you talk a bit about what your approach is there in beyond the kind of strongholds where you have strong public sector collective bargaining rights? How do you operate there? What do you offer to the teachers in these other parts of the country?
So, I was just looking for one of the placards that we have. One of the things that we do, and we can make sure that your listeners see. This is on our website. It is our focus this year, which is called the Freedom to Thrive, and for all people. And one of the things that we offer is basically something that any activist would tell you, which is together you can accomplish what is impossible to do alone. That ultimately, when people band together, they can actually get things done in a way that most of us don't have the power to do alone. And what has happened in a lot of these places that are very anti-union, take Texas, it prohibits collective bargaining for educators. So what they have to do is they have to use the politics. They have to run people in school board elections. They have to try to use school boards as basically creating, policy. And so they get involved politically. But what also really happens in places that are virulently anti-labor is that you see really, really terrible conditions. You see a lot of bullying. You see a lot of harassment. You see a lot of turnover. You see very little risk-taking. And ultimately, that's what people at one point or another, and this is what you saw with Red for Ed, and frankly, many of the Red for Ed folks in Kentucky have come to us, and we are working with them to create unions now. Because what they were so, there's a point of no return. And with social media, people could work together, see each other, talk to each other. They could also pre-COVID, and ultimately this will happen again, be together in person. And they saw that together they could actually fight something and win the hearts and minds of basically parents and community who at the end of the day really know that they need and love their teachers, and understood that, like in Oklahoma, if you have a book, a social studies book that's 50, 60 years old, how is that okay in terms of that kid's teaching? If you have a teacher who is hiding, because she's working in McDonald's as her second or third job, and her kids and their parents just come into that McDonald's and she feels ashamed that she's working there, how is that helpful? So ultimately, what happened in the 2018 strikes is that the conditions in West Virginia and Kentucky and Arizona had gotten so bad that they saw what happened in West Virginia, and they said, we can do this too. And now what we have to do as unions, which is what we're doing now, is help them create infrastructure so that they can, regardless of what the laws are, create the kind of collective action. And ultimately, I hope collective bargaining, if we can get the PRO Act and the public sector analog, that they need to lift conditions for students and lift wages for themselves.
I think when we look across the kind of ups and downs of the American labor movement, and actually I think this is true internationally, it's really striking that there's a certain fundamental thing unions do of representing the existing members and winning good wages and conditions for them. But unions, labor movements that aren't open and inclusive in terms of reaching out to the people who don't currently have representation, they go into decline, right? If you become an insular movement, the pattern we see historically and internationally is that you see decline.
I mean, you know, what you're saying, Alex, reminds me of something that happened just yesterday. I was in Minnesota at the George Floyd Square. One of our members was one of, she hates being called this, so she hates being called a leader. So I'm just going to say she was key to really keeping that space as sacred space. And our Secretary Treasurer Fed Ingram and I saw her in October when we were doing a Get Out the Vote campaign across the country, but we wanted to stop in Minnesota to pay homage. And she was at the space and she was about to take a leave of absence, and unpaid leave of absence. So we have been helping her. We funded her paid leave of absence so she could keep on doing this work. And we talked to her in the last few days before the verdict, and we sent a bunch of staff to help because they wanted to keep the space a sacred space regardless of what happened. And I went out myself for Tuesday and Wednesday and was with her and was in the space when the verdict was read. But the point I'm trying to make is not that. The next day was what was for us equally important, in that community said, we're going to keep fighting for the justice demands that we have. And what were those justice demands? How do we create opportunity for our kids? How do we make sure we have decent housing and transportation? How do we make sure that there's decent jobs? How do we keep this square sacred? How do we not just ensure that there is one criminal justice system, not two, one that's racist, one that's, not, but how do we deal with all of the things, all of the institutional racism? And as we were doing that, the other people in the community kept saying, and Marsha's union is here, and Marsha's union has her back, and Marsha's union has our back. And that is the best of unionism. When people used to kid, the unions gave us the weekend. We have to be a social and economic justice movement for all, which is your point, and which is what bargaining for the common good is about, which is why issues around service delivery and making sure that the quality of what we do in the trades, in education, is the best we can be. We have to be open-minded and broad-minded about America and what we need for everyone to thrive, not just our own membership.
We've started to get some questions from our audience, so I'm going to turn.
And sorry about the sun. Wherever I'm sitting, there's like sun coming in every now and then. Sun
is great. Up in Ithaca, I'm looking out at snow flurries today, which is April 22nd is a little rough, but we'll make do. So
I'm used to it snowing in May.
Yeah, right. So one of the questions coming in is about somebody's been talking with some teachers and finding many of them are struggling, with all the pressures this year, and just asking what steps can we take to support the teachers who are finding this particularly tough currently. And I think across the country, people are seeing this. How can they help out?
So first off, whoever is asking that question, thank you for the question. The burnout is real, and I'm seeing it all across every unit I represent, meaning nurses, healthcare, other healthcare, educators, EMTs, other public employees, bus drivers. The burnout is real, and part of the difference between these essential workers and others who work in America is that teachers in particular, and bus drivers and school employees, they've had to do like 18,000 different kinds of jobs this year and last year. And you can't keep changing all the time and have the reserve and be the kind of person, the authentic self that your kids are relying on, because they're relying on their parents and they're relying on you. And so people are really tired and exhausted, and the making them political folly because people don't want to blame Trump for creating a mess. Trump didn't create COVID, but he created a mess about the recovery, has been really, really hard. So I expect a lot of retirements this year. I didn't expect it last year because, the economy was also so bad. I expect a lot of retirements this year. And I have been basically saying to educators, I said that to people in White Plains today, people have to take a break. They have to take a break. We have to create some self-care for ourselves and for others. So what you could do, thank a teacher. If you see somebody, if you're on Twitter or Facebook and you see people basically blaming them or their union, get into that fray and say, that's just not true. Thank them for what they've done, because they have really tried to make sure that our kids have as stable and secure a year as they possibly could this year.
Question, a difficult one, a difficult issue on vaccination. What are your thoughts on vaccination requirements? The question of requiring teachers or students to be vaccinated. Just a disclosure, Cornell, we are requiring students next year to be vaccinated at the start of the fall semester. Ours are college students, so they're all age eligible. We haven't yet announced that with faculty and staff, though we're sort of similar position with our faculty to where you are with the teachers, where there's very high vaccination. But I wonder if we may have a small percentage who would rather not. What are your thoughts on that?
So let me tell you my personal thoughts and my professional thoughts.
Yeah.
Personally, I believe in 100% vaccination. Now, I am the sister of 2 doctors. I represent a lot of healthcare, and we've done our homework, and I personally believe in it. I think that this year, because of all of this misinformation and disinformation that we've lived through, from the big lie about elections to, all of this, I think we have to be careful this year to not make the mandatoriness the issue, and really try to convince people this year who may be vaccine hesitant that they need to do this for themselves and for others. And so we've been very careful not to broach the isso of whether or not it's mandatory until we can actually get through this vaccination process this year. I would say that in the next couple of years, just like measles vaccines are mandatory and other vaccines are mandatory, ultimately, we're going to be facing that, COVID vaccines will be mandatory. But I think this year we have to convince people, and we have to actually meet fear with facts and meet ideology with facts and with patriotism.
Yeah, and I think that kind of the almost the supply side of making sure the vaccination is really key. That was part of our thinking at Cornell. We have the capability to make sure that the vaccination is available to all the students. So a student who comes who isn't vaccinated, we're going to be providing that for them. I think that kind of getting the resources out and making sure it's out there in the community is going to be key.
I do think, though, that the kind of COVID testing that's been done on campuses, I'm a big, big believer in COVID testing. I think that it has made, so, when you hear the roadmap that the AFT has talked about, frankly, since last April, vaccine access obviously came later, but It was the layered mitigation, including the vaccines, as well as the kind of working together to create trust. But the layered mitigation and testing, as well as the relationship building, because what the testing does is, in a disease that is so asymptomatic, it lets you see things before the outbreak and before an outbreak. And I think that that testing is going to be, as long as we're in a race with the variants, testing is going to be a piece of our lives, and that kind of testing needs to continue to happen.
Yeah. I think we have time for maybe one last question. Some interesting one that somebody says there have been some children or families who've actually thrived in remote synchronous learning environments. Is there a niche for them going forward? Can we take something positive from this kind of difficult experience that we had to go through this year? Could we use that somehow?
Yes, of course we can, and I think that there will be. I think that some online work is here with us to stay. It can't be a substitute for in-person education, and it can't be and it can't be viewed as cost saver. I think that we're going to do, and we're going to have to do some research over the course of the next 2 or 3 years about what worked and what didn't work, in order to really create best practices that are not simply anecdotal. Mm-hmm. But there's a way of integrating online and in person. The piece that I'm really worried about, and you have this with homeschooling too, is that if we don't really go back to a robust in-person community, the socialization that's really needed for kids to develop, mm-hmm. but also for a society to develop and to be more open-hearted, mm-hmm. and understand each other's lived experience doesn't happen. The isolation of remote, mm-hmm. Has been probably, other than obviously death, and severe illness, has been probably the most long-standing harm that has happened out of COVID. And so we have to recreate a community of learners and a community, mm-hmm. that comes back together again. So will there be a role, particularly for some kids who thrive? Yes. And could they do it in school, or could they do some other ways of learning? Yes, of course. Yeah. But in school learning, school as a place needs to be the dominant way in which our society operates going forward.
Yeah. I think that's such an important lesson. It's something that we've learned as well here at the university. We have sort of amazing online education through our eCornell platform, and we do in-person professional education down in New York City. But we also have really learned again this year how important that experience of a campus community up here in Ithaca, New York, amidst the snow, getting the students together, the value of that, and just seeing the students coming, how much they appreciate. And now the high school students are now applying for next year. And I think we're appreciating in the education world a lot of things that maybe we took a little for granted. And I think this has kind of shown to us the value of that. So thank you so much for this conversation. This has been an absolute pleasure, Randy. I always love talking to you, but I'm really glad to be able to share this with our listeners today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex. And again, I just want to say to the students who are at Cornell or ILR, look, it's an amazing institution, and it is really both ILR and Cornell, and the fact that Cornell is, a hybrid land-grant institution as well as a private institution. I am very, very grateful for the education that I got at Cornell. And thank you, Alex, for the honor of talking to you in this webinar. Thank you.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.